In the shadow of a forgotten empire stands one of history's most provocative mysteries, a tale of hubris, power, and divine intervention that has captivated humanity for millennia. The Tower of Babel, a monument to human ambition that provoked God himself to intervene, and behind it all, a shadowy figure whose very name has become synonymous with rebellion against the divine order. His name is Nimrod. Though never explicitly named as the tower's architect in Genesis, ancient Jewish historian Josephus and centuries of tradition place Nimrod at the heart of this defiant project. The Bible tells us almost nothing about him, just 5 cryptic verses that have launched countless theories. Yet these fragmentary words conceal an astonishing revelation about the composition of the Bible itself. Genesis introduces him as a mighty hunter before the Lord, founder of great cities including Babel and Shinar. Then in the very next chapter, we're told of humanity united by one language, building a city and tower in Shinar, whose top reaches to the heavens. Not as some literal assault on God's throne, but as a brazen statement, let us make a name for ourselves. But there's a glaring problem hidden in plain sight that scholars have wrestled with for centuries. The text places Nimrod as a son of Cush, a region in Africa, yet everything about him points to Mesopotamia, thousands of miles away. And the tower story itself, far from a simple moral fable about divine punishment. Modern scholars like Ronald Hendel recognize this narrative as a sophisticated double critique, externally a hidden criticism of imperial Babylonian power, and internally a universal meditation on human pride. As Hendel puts it, the story masks a criticism of present political realities within a tale of primeval times. What if I told you that neither Nimrod nor the Tower of Babel story are what they seem? What if these narratives weren't recording literal history, but were crafted as theological responses to real imperial powers that dominated the ancient Near East? What if Nimrod himself was a literary shadow of Mesopotamian kings so powerful that their memory echoed for millennia? Most astonishingly, what if the biblical authors deliberately placed these narratives as a critical pivot point, the moment when God abandons working with humanity as a whole and instead turns to one man, Abraham, to begin a new chapter in salvation history? In this video, we unveil the forgotten kings behind the biblical myths of Nimrod and Babel, a revelation that challenges everything we thought we knew about these mysterious passages and exposes their true purpose as sophisticated theological responses to imperial power. Let's begin with what the Bible actually tells us. Genesis introduces Nimrod with these words. Cush was the father of Nimrod, who became a mighty warrior on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. That is why it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The first centers of his kingdom were Babylon, Uruk, Akkad, and Calneh in Shinar. From that land, he went to Assyria, where he built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Calah, and Resen. For centuries, this passage has baffled biblical scholars. It interrupts a dry genealogical list with a sudden mini-narrative about a legendary hero king. More puzzling still, it places Nimrod, builder of Mesopotamian cities, as a descendant of Cush, which normally refers to Nubia or Ethiopia in Africa. This geographic disconnect is like saying the founder of New York City came from Australia. It simply doesn't align with what we know about ancient history. This passage has all the hallmarks of being inserted from a different source. It's as if someone took a fragment of one tradition and wove it into an entirely different genealogical framework. But this contradiction isn't a simple scribal error. It's the first clue in an extraordinary revelation about how biblical authors constructed their narratives from older material. The mystery deepens when we look at the name itself. Nimrod isn't a Cushite name. In fact, it doesn't appear anywhere in the historical record outside the Bible. So who was Nimrod really? And why was his story so important that biblical editors found a way to include it, even if it meant creating a geographic impossibility? The answer lies not in Africa, but in the royal courts of ancient Mesopotamia, where powerful kings once ruled the land between two rivers and left behind legends that would echo through the millennia. Before we unravel Nimrod's true identity, we must first understand the deeper context of the Tower of Babel narrative. Far from being an isolated biblical tale, this story draws on and subverts ancient Mesopotamian myths that would have been well known to educated scribes in the ancient Near East. In the Sumerian epic, Enmerkar and the Lord of Arata, dating roughly around 2000 BCE, at least 1,000 years before the likely composition of Genesis, I would say 1,500 years, we find an astonishing parallel to the Bible's language confusion story. The whole universe, the people in unison, to Enlil in one tongue spoke. Then Enki changed the speech in their mouths, brought contention into it, into the speech of man that had been won. This is honestly remarkable. Here we have a Mesopotamian myth where the god Enki, their deity of wisdom, confounds human speech that was once unified. The parallel to Genesis 11 is unmistakable, yet Genesis places Yahweh in control of this pivotal moment. Even the specific details in Genesis betray its Mesopotamian origins. The Bible makes a point of noting that the builders used baked bricks and bitumen for mortar, construction methods unique to southern Mesopotamia, where stone was scarce but completely foreign to Israel's stone-based architecture. This echoes Babylonian creation myths like the Enuma Elish, which culminates with gods collectively building Babylon and its temple. The Anunnaki gods took up their tools. For a whole year they made bricks. When the second year arrived, they raised high the head of Esagila, the temple. Inscriptions from Nebuchadnezzar II, who rebuilt Babylon's great ziggurat in the 6th century BCE, boasts, "I mobilized countries everywhere. I built their structures with bitumen and baked brick throughout. I completed it, raising its top to the heaven." The biblical phrase, "whose top reaches to the heavens," isn't describing a literal assault on God's throne. It's directly quoting Mesopotamian royal propaganda about ziggurats, which were called by names like House of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth. The theme of humans seeking immortal fame through building also appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the hero builds massive city walls to make a name for himself, the exact phrase used in Genesis 11. Yet both Gilgamesh and the tower builders ultimately failed to transcend human limitations. Another telling parallel comes from the Epic of Etana, where a king attempts to fly to heaven on an eagle's back, only to be returned to earth. Clear statement that the divine realm is not meant for mortals. This boundary between heaven and earth is precisely what the Babel narrative enforces. What emerges is a pattern. The biblical authors weren't creating these stories from nothing. They were deliberately engaging with and transforming well-known Mesopotamian myths. They're myths, but they were subverting them to communicate a distinctly Israelite theological message. In Mesopotamian text, ziggurats were stairways for the gods to descend to earth. In Genesis, humans trying to build their own stairway to heaven are scattered. Powerful statement that heaven is God's realm alone, and that attempts to storm it through human achievement are doomed to fail. Around 2350 BCE, a man named Sargon rose from obscurity to become history's first empire builder. According to his own legend, preserved in clay tablets, he began as a humble gardener or cupbearer to the king of, you guessed it, Kish. In Kish, Sargon served as cupbearer to Baba. Through the love of the goddess Ishtar, Sargon became king. From this start in Kish, Sargon launched history's first documented imperial conquests. He subdued all of Mesopotamia, uniting the city-states of Sumer and extending his rule into Assyria, precisely matching the Bible's description of Nimrod's kingdom spanning from Shinar, southern Mesopotamia, to Assyria in the north. He founded a new capital city called Akkad, established dynastic rule, and created an empire that would become the template for all future Mesopotamian kingdoms. The parallels with Nimrod are striking. Both begin in the land of Kish, Kush. Both establish the first kingdoms. Both rule the same exact territory. But the Nimrod connection doesn't end with Sargon. His grandson, Naram-Sin, took the empire to even greater heights. Naram-Sin did something unprecedented. He declared himself divine, a god of Akkad, with artistic depictions showing him wearing the horned crown of the gods. This self-deification might explain why later Jewish and Christian traditions portrayed Nimrod as rebellious against God. He was remembered as the king who made himself divine. The name Nimrod itself may be a hidden commentary. In Hebrew, it likely derives from the root marad, meaning to rebel, essentially the rebel. This would be a perfect Hebrew characterization of a king who claimed divine status. Even more compelling is the hunting connection. Naram-Sin and later Mesopotamian kings were celebrated as mighty hunters, particularly of lions, a royal sport symbolizing dominance over chaos. Assyrian palaces were adorned with spectacular reliefs of kings engaged in ritual lion hunts. Mighty hunters indeed. When Genesis calls Nimrod a mighty hunter before the Lord, it's preserving this royal Mesopotamian ideology, but placing it under the sovereignty of Yahweh. The evidence is astonishing. Nearly every detail attributed to Nimrod in Genesis perfectly matches what we know of these Akkadian kings. But the most remarkable part of this story isn't about the distant past. It's about what was happening when the Nimrod story was written down. But the Tower of Babel wasn't just inspired by ancient myths. It was almost certainly based on real structure that stood at the heart of Babylon itself. A colossal monument that would have dominated the skyline when Judean exiles were forcibly relocated there in the 6th century BCE. Its name was Etemenanki, House of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth, the Great Ziggurat of Babylon. Archaeological excavations reveal a massive square base, approximately 300 feet on each side. Rising in 7-tiered levels, it may have reached a height of nearly 300 feet, the equivalent of a 30-story modern building. This remarkable artifact, known as the Tower of Babel stele, provides the oldest known depiction of Babylon's ziggurat. On it, King Nebuchadnezzar II stands proudly beside the tower he rebuilt, with an inscription explicitly identifying it as Etemenanki, the ziggurat of Babylon. For Judean exiles living in Babylon after Jerusalem's destruction, Etemenanki would have been an overwhelming sight. Imagine being dragged from your homeland to this alien city dominated by this towering structure dedicated to foreign gods. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. The tower's actual history mirrors elements of the biblical story in fascinating ways. We know it was damaged by Assyrian king Sennacherib in 689 BCE and remained partially ruined for decades. Nebuchadnezzar II later boasted of rebuilding it to completion around 590 BCE, precisely when many Judeans were living in Babylonian exile. In his own words, "I rebuilt Etemenanki, the ziggurat of Babylon, and brought it to completion, raising its top with glazed blue tiles to the heavens." The biblical authors brilliantly subverted this Babylonian propaganda. Where Nebuchadnezzar proclaimed his tower reached heaven, Genesis has God come down to see it, implying it was actually quite small from the divine perspective. Even the name Babel contains a masterful linguistic jab. In Akkadian, Babylon was called Babili, meaning Gate of God, a proud title proclaiming the city's cosmic significance. But the Hebrew author transforms this into Babel, explained as deriving from Balal, meaning to confuse. With this wordplay, the biblical writer demotes the mighty Babylon from gate of God to place of confusion, a subtle act of theological resistance by an exiled people. Fascinatingly, the tower's eventual fate seems to validate the biblical narrative. It fell into despair again and was finally demolished by Alexander the Great in the 4th century BCE. For centuries afterwards, travelers identified various ziggurat ruins, especially at nearby Borsippa, called Burs Nimrod, as the fabled Tower of Babel. The image of this tower has captivated human imagination for millennia, from Peter Bruegel's famous painting to countless modern depictions. But beneath the myth lies this historical reality, a real tower built by real kings that became the perfect symbol for human imperial ambition and its ultimate limitations. Fast forward to the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, the likely period when the Nimrod account took its final form, according to many scholars, some actually go later. Israel and Judah lived in the shadow of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the superpower of its day. Assyrian kings like Sargon II, yes, deliberately named after the ancient Sargon, claimed to be the inheritors of the Akkadian imperial legacy. These kings revived the memory of Sargon of Akkad and his dynasty as propaganda to legitimize their own imperial ambitions. They even rebuilt the ancient city of Akkad as a symbolic act connecting their rule to Sargon's legacy. They also emphasized royal lion hunting as proof of divine favor, with spectacular palace reliefs showing kings as mighty hunters protected by the gods. Sound familiar? This reveals something profound about the Nimrod passage. Biblical authors weren't simply preserving ancient history. They were engaging with contemporary Assyrian imperial ideology. The Nimrod account functions as a sophisticated theological response to Assyrian propaganda. By portraying Nimrod as a mighty hunter before the Lord, Hebrew writers acknowledged Assyrian power but subtly placed it under Yahweh's sovereignty. The story that immediately follows Nimrod in Genesis, the Tower of Babel, reinforces this reading. After introducing the mighty empire builder, the Bible shows God confounding human pride and scattering humanity. Together, these narratives deliver a powerful counter-message to imperial propaganda. Even the mightiest kings remain subject to divine judgment. In a masterful literary move, biblical authors took the very figures Assyria was celebrating, ancient kings of Akkad, and transformed them into a cautionary tale about the limits of human power. Nimrod becomes both an acknowledgement of imperial might and a subtle critique of it. But perhaps the most astonishing aspect of the Tower of Babel story is that it's not unique to the Bible or the Middle East. Across the globe, from Mexico to Africa, indigenous peoples tell strikingly similar tales of ambitious tower builders who angered the gods, leading to the confusion of languages and the scattering of humanity. In Mesoamerica, the Aztec legend of the Great Pyramid of Cholula tells of giants who survived a great flood and decided to build a tower reaching the sky. Their leader, Zelula, constructed a massive brick pyramid, but the angry gods hurled fire down, destroying the tower and thwarting their ambition. Another version from the Toltecs mirrors Genesis even more closely. After a flood, people multiplied and built a high tower to protect themselves from future catastrophe. But as they neared heaven, their languages were confounded and they scattered across the earth. The Tohono O'odham people of Arizona tell of Montezuma, who after surviving a great flood, became prideful and attempted to build a house reaching to heaven. The Great Spirit destroyed it with a thunderbolt, fragmenting his creation. In Africa, the pattern continues. The Lazi of Zambia described men stacking poles or trees to reach God who had fled to the sky. When their structure collapsed, the climbers perished. The Ashanti of Ghana believed heaven was once very close to earth, but when humans piled their grain-pounding pestles one atop another to reach the divine realm, the tower toppled. After that, heaven became remote and languages multiplied. Even in Southeast Asia, the Karen people of Myanmar preserved a tradition of ancestors who came from a land with a mighty pagoda, where languages were confounded, forcing their migration away. These global parallels are truly remarkable. While some may be diffusions of biblical story via missionaries or traders, others likely have independent origins, suggesting a universal human preoccupation with explaining linguistic diversity and the consequences of overreaching ambition. All these stories share common elements: a lofty structure reaching toward heaven, divine anger, the destruction of the tower, and often the confounding of language. They speak to a fundamental human question: why do we speak different languages? And why can't we reach the heavens? The Genesis version stands out for its monotheistic framework and theological sophistication, where other myths sometimes emphasize divine jealousy or arbitrary punishment. Babel presents language diversity as part of God's plan to fulfill the command to fill the earth, a check on human pride, but also a catalyst for cultural development. And keep in mind, these parallels don't diminish the biblical account. They enhance its significance by revealing how deeply it resonates with universal human experience. The Tower of Babel story captures something profound about the human nature itself. Our ambition to reach the heavens, our tendency toward prideful unity, and the divine establishment of limits that paradoxically allow for greater human flourishing through diversity. And at the heart of this universal story stands the enigmatic figure who tradition identifies as the tower's builder, Nimrod, whose true identity may now be revealed. The biblical Nimrod isn't simply Sargon or Naram-Sin, or even a generic king of Kish. He is a literary composite that encapsulates the entire concept of Mesopotamian kingship. Consider the evidence. Nimrod is associated with Kish after the flood, matching how the Sumerian king list says kingship descended to Kish. after the waters receded. He found cities including Babel and Akkad, just as Sargon founded Akkad and ruled over Babylon. His realm extends from Shinar to Assyria, precisely tracing the Akkadian Empire's boundaries. He's remembered as the first great king and hunter, reflecting Mesopotamian royal ideology. His story is placed between the flood and Babel, the exact time frame when the Akkadian Empire flourished. The genius of the biblical account is how it distills centuries of Mesopotamian history into a single archetypal figure. Nimrod becomes the embodiment of human empire building, impressive yet ultimately under divine sovereignty. What we're seeing isn't historical error, but sophisticated literary adaptation. The biblical authors weren't trying to write a history textbook. They were creating a theological narrative about human civilization that incorporated well-known traditions about ancient kings. This explains why the prophet Micah, writing in the 8th century BCE, could simply reference the land of Nimrod as a synonym for Assyria without further explanation. His audience would have immediately understood Nimrod as the archetypal Mesopotamian king. Far from undermining the Bible, this discovery reveals the sophisticated literary techniques of its authors, how they wove together historical memories, contemporary politics, and theological messages into narratives that have captivated readers for millennia. We've uncovered the mythic origins of Nimrod and the historical foundations of the Tower of Babel, but perhaps the most revelatory aspect of this story is its profound political and theological meaning for the people who gave it the final form. The Judean exiles living under Babylonian domination in the 6th century BCE. Imagine the psychological trauma. Jerusalem destroyed, the temple in ruins, and thousands of Judean elites forcibly relocated to the very heart of the empire that had crushed them. Each day, these exiles would have looked upon Babylon's towering ziggurat, a constant reminder of their subjugation to foreign gods and kings. The Tower of Babel narrative should be understood as resistance literature, in what scholar Ronald Hindle calls a hidden transcript of the oppressed. Judean writers embedded a subtle but devastating critique of imperial power within an apparently innocent primeval tale. Beneath its surface, this brief story mounts a systematic assault on Babylonian imperial ideology. Where Nebuchadnezzar boasted of uniting all peoples under his rule to build eternal monuments, Genesis portrays such unity as shallow and doomed to divine disruption. The very name Babel becomes a brilliant act of linguistic subversion. By deriving Babylon's name not from its proud etymology, Bab-Eli, gate of God, but from the Hebrew Balal, to confuse, the writers transformed the empire's self-glorification into mockery. For captive Judeans, this story offered profound consolation. It declared that the empire holding them captive stood under divine judgment. The unfinished tower in the narrative would have resonated with their hopes that Babylon's grand ambitions would likewise remain incomplete. The story also elevates Israel's God over the gods of Mesopotamia. In Babylonian myth, multiple deities cooperate to build Babylon as their cult center. Genesis insists that one God, Yahweh, sovereignly orchestrates human affairs, descending from heaven to inspect and judge human works. Most significantly, in the structure of Genesis, the Babel narrative sets the stage for God's alternative solution to human alienation. Immediately after the tower's failure and the scattering of the peoples, the text introduces Abraham, called out from Ur of Chaldeans, from the very heart of Mesopotamia. This literary sequence delivers a powerful message. From the ruins of Babel's confusion emerges the covenant with Abraham, through whom all peoples of the earth will be blessed. Where human empire building fails, God's covenant promises succeed. By the time the Babel story reached its final form, history had vindicated its message. Babylon did fall, its grand monuments were abandoned, the exiles did return to their homeland. As one scholar puts it, the mighty empire that sought to hold mankind together under its rule was in the end fragmented. In a profound theological twist, what appears at first as divine punishment, the confusion of languages, can also be read as divine blessing. The scattering of peoples led to the rich picture of human cultures that we see today. What Babylon sought to homogenize, God diversified. Perhaps this is the most enduring insight of the Babel story. Not simply that human pride goes before fall, but that through apparent defeat, God works his purposes. The failure of Babel made possible the covenant with Abraham, just as the fall of Jerusalem made possible a renewed Israel. In our world of towering skyscrapers and renewed imperial ambitions, the ancient message of Babel still resonates. No human tower, no matter how impressive, can reach heaven by its own effort. No human tower, no matter how impressive, can reach heaven by its own effort. True unity comes not through forced homogeneity, but through embracing the diversity God has ordained. And what of Nimrod, the mighty hunter whose shadow looms behind this tale? His legend reminds us that even the greatest kings, whether Sargon, Naram-Sin, or Nebuchadnezzar, are in the end merely mortal. Their empires rise and fall, while the story of humanity continues. Thank you for watching this video. Please like it, comment down your favorite part. There's much more that can be said. Join our Patreon, support us as a member of the YouTube, and sign up for one of our scholarly courses at mvp-courses.com. Again, have a great day.